From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Friday, May 24. It's been 2 years since Labor won government and Anthony Albanese is coming for Peter Dutton. The PM will launch a ferocious political attack on the opposition leader in a speech marking the election anniversary today. He says Dutton's a carbon copy of his predecessor Scott Morrison, and he'll urge voters to reject fear and division stoked by the coalition in the run-up to the election. That story's live right now at theaustralian.com.au. 6 years after the teacher's pet made waves around the world, The Australian's national chief correspondent Hedley Thomas is back with a brand new podcast investigation. This time, Hedley's delving into the cold case of Bronwyn Winfield, a young mum who disappeared from an idyllic surf town on the New South Wales North Coast more than 3 decades ago. In today's episode, Hedley explains how this story found him and if he thinks it can be solved. In 2018, Australian journalism blew up with a huge story told in a gripping new way. An investigative podcast by The Australian's national chief correspondent Hedley Thomas. The Teacher's Pet has had more than 80 million downloads around the world, and it resulted in the arrest, charge and murder conviction of its subject, Christopher Michael Dawson. He is now appealing. What almost no one knows is that at that time, another big story was brewing in the background. Family members and friends of another missing woman, Bronwyn Winfield, were struck by the similarities between her case and that of Lynette Sims, whose disappearance Hedley investigated in The Teacher's Pet. In those early days, years before Lynn's husband Chris Dawson would be brought to justice, Bronwyn's loved ones reached out to Hedley, urging him to look into her 1991 disappearance from Lennox Head in the New South Wales Northern Rivers region. But Bronwyn's name was already on Hedley's radar.
It was late 2017, Claire. I was interviewing the former Deputy State Coroner for New South Wales, Karl Milovanovich, about the case of Chris Dawson and the allegations that he'd murdered his wife, Lynn, all those years ago in 1982. And while I was talking to Karl, he expressed his grave concerns about a number of cases involving missing women who had suddenly disappeared. They had ties to the community, they had small children. Lynn was one of those, and he mentioned the case of Bronwyn Winfield. He told me that he'd run an inquest into that case in 2002. And he'd made a recommendation about it.
Here's the moment Hedley first heard Bronwyn Winfield's name from Karl Milovanovich.
I did an inquest of a lady called Bronwyn Winfield, and she had 2 kids as well. And she went to bed one night and she disappeared next day, and there was some suggestion from a neighbour that...
And I didn't have time then to deal with it, but I wanted to revisit it at some point. And I guess for the last 6.5 years, I've been collecting bits and pieces and talking to people connected to the case, reaching out to Bronwyn's family. What also happened was that as the episodes of The Teacher's Pet began unfolding from May 2018, people who were listening, they were reminded of something that had just eaten away at them for some time, that there hadn't been a proper resolution of Bronwyn's disappearance, the deeply suspicious circumstances surrounding it, and they urged me to get involved in it.
Today, all the information and evidence Hedley collected over the years has made it out of the folder he created on that day in 2017 and into a new podcast investigation for The Australian. It's called Bronwyn, and it is hauntingly similar to the disappearance of Lynn Dawson. Loving young mums, sudden disappearances, families left in the grief and shock of ambiguous loss.
Sadly, it's the case that across Australia, police forces through the 80s and 90s and no doubt earlier were unwilling to look at foul play as the probable reason for the sudden disappearances of loving, dedicated young mums, particularly those going through a marital breakdown. So when they disappeared, the paperwork was just filed in the bottom drawer marked missing person, not given a high priority as a possible homicide. And this is what Karl Milovanovich identified in a number of these missing women cases that he dealt with as a senior coroner before his retirement. When he flagged that to me, when I met him at his home in late 2017, it was a bit of a light bulb moment, because you think, gosh, how many other cases are there? This was a systemic problem. It's no longer the case today if a young mum like Bronwyn suddenly disappeared at the same time as she's newly separated from her husband. There would almost certainly be a very committed police investigation looking at all of the unusual circumstances and making sure that witnesses were soon interviewed. But unbelievably, for the first 5 years after Bronwyn's disappearance, the police did not even take a statement from anybody. They spoke to just a couple of neighbours. They didn't bring anyone down to the police station to take a formal statement. They didn't properly search the house or the car. It's hard to believe how poor the original investigation was.
Bronwyn Winfield was just 31 years old when she disappeared from the home built by her husband, John.
Bronwyn was, to everybody who knew her, an incredibly caring and devoted young mum. She had 2 daughters. They were Lauren, who was 5, and Crystal, 10. Bronwyn was close to her brother, her cousins. She'd had a difficult childhood because her own mother, when Bronwyn was 2, had postnatal depression, and she disappeared from her own young children. And very sadly, when Bronwyn herself disappeared some 29 years after her own mother had disappeared, there was, for the police, a link. They thought, well, is she doing what her own mother had done? The circumstances were very, very different. Bronwyn was of very sound mind. She had plans. She was making plans. She had appointments the next day. The kids were going back to school on the Monday.
John was Bronwyn's second husband, and the relationship had been strained for some time.
She wanted to leave her husband, John, and indeed she did. She moved into a townhouse that she couldn't really afford, but she knew she had to get away. Only a short drive from the family home, the home that John had built. He's a very skilled bricklayer. He could build houses from scratch, and this house was his pride and joy. She disappeared on the Sunday evening. She had very little money. She didn't have means to support herself, but she and her husband were going to be having an argument over who got the spoils from the marriage. How would that property settlement unfold? And on the evening she disappeared, her husband had left Sydney to fly back. He'd been working in Sydney, building a house, and he became aware that Bronwyn had moved from the rented townhouse with the girls back into the family home, the home that she had had to leave when they separated. She was there for 2 nights, and then on the Sunday, John arrived, and that's the last time anybody ever saw or heard from Bronwyn.
Yeah, she tucked her children into bed that night, Hedley. How do we know that? Were the children interviewed by police?
Bronwyn's eldest daughter did talk to police several years later, but the children were also in touch with their auntie and uncle. They spoke to their neighbours and friends, and it's not disputed by John that the children were in bed that Sunday night. In fact, John readily acknowledges that he was at the house too, and according to some accounts, he acknowledged that he actually had a disagreement with Bronwyn on the Sunday night. But his story is that she got into a car after she had made 1 or 2 phone calls from the bedroom. A car turned up. He doesn't know what sort of car it was. He said he couldn't see the driver, doesn't know who was driving it. she got into that vehicle and left. Now, it was a very unusual thing for her to do, to go away for a break. She hadn't told her friends she was going away for any sort of break. She left behind pretty much everything, and she had very little in the way of money. That's why her family was very concerned immediately, but local police did a very poor job in the early stages. They really just treated Bronwyn as if she was doing what her mother had done, that she was a runaway mum abandoning her family, her husband, her kids. Crystal has described having heard raised voices, her parents arguing, and then she must have fallen asleep because she was woken up along with Lauren late at night, probably around 10:30 p.m, maybe a little bit earlier. John left the house with his daughters and drove through the night to Sydney, arriving the next morning. The children were due at school on the Monday. It wasn't school holidays, and they ended up staying in Sydney for 10 or 11 days, and then John, at the urging of Bronwyn's brother, drove back up to Lennox and did report Bronwyn missing to police.
Coming up, why it's taken so long for Bronwyn Winfield's case to be taken seriously. The podcast Bronwyn is available now at bronwynpodcast.com. That's BRONWYN podcast.com. Subscribers to The Australian are the first to hear episodes of Hedley Thomas's brand new investigative podcast series. Plus, they get breaking news alerts direct to their phones, all our lively commentary and access to special events. Check us out at theaustralian.com.au, and we'll be back after this break. There were 11 days between Bronwyn Winfield was last seen and the time her husband John reported her missing to police. On his account, Bronwyn had said she was going away for a few days to take some time for herself. So, why the delay?
I think that's a very good question, Claire, and as best I can understand from talking to Bronwyn's family and friends, they were waiting for John to make that move, and they were urging him to do so for some time. Andy, who is Bronwyn's brother, he had told John that if he didn't report Bronwyn missing to the police, Andy would. A woman called Deb Hall, who was Bronwyn's very good friend and nearest neighbour, she told me that she said words to the same effect. She was very, very concerned about Bronwyn and what had happened. She knew how devoted Bronwyn was as a mum, the plans that Bronwyn had made. She was happy to be back in her house. She had flagged no plan or intention to leave the house. And Deb couldn't see when Deb went through the house that Bronwyn had actually taken anything with her, except for her handbag, which wasn't there.
In 2002, the former Deputy State Coroner Karl Milovanovich, who you heard about at the top of this episode, found Bronwyn Winfield was dead. He recommended to the New South Wales Director of Public Prosecutions that John Winfield be charged with her murder. Nicholas Cowdery, who was the DPP then, didn't pursue it. He said there was no evidence John had killed Bronwyn or played any role in her death. It's a decision that's baffled Bronwyn's loved ones for decades. This is a feature of the justice system that I think some people might not know so much about. Can you explain, Hedley, how it can be that a coroner can make a recommendation about a case like this that doesn't turn into a prosecution?
I think that there's such a mismatch between what happens when a coroner runs an inquest involving sometimes many days, sometimes a week of public hearings with witnesses appearing and giving evidence under oath. And then the coroner, who's often an experienced senior magistrate, makes certain findings and recommendations. And then there's this behind closed door paperwork review by unknown lawyers in the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. They review the recommendation and Presumably they go through the evidence. Often the police brief is very extensive, but how much of the evidence do they go through? Do they read all the transcripts and witness statements? Are they at a sufficiently senior level to really appreciate what the senior coroner has appreciated? We don't know because that process is very opaque.
You reached out to John Winfield. What did he say?
John Winfield got back to me and he acknowledged the letter that I had written to him seeking his side of the story. He said that he had previously answered something like 415 questions from a homicide squad detective, and he stood by all the answers he gave to those, and we'll unpack those in several episodes of the podcast series. He said also, and I think this is very interesting because it's a reflection of some of the things that have been said over the years by him about Bronwyn, that her side of the family has a long generational history of mental illness on the male and female side. That's how he put it. Now, I've talked to Bronwyn's good friends in Lennox Head. I've talked to family members. The police have obviously talked to many people because when the police did do a very thorough investigation starting in 1998, many dozens of statements were taken by Detective Sergeant Glenn Taylor. And in none of those interviews or statements does anyone say Bronwyn was showing signs of mental illness. It just doesn't register. Bronwyn was a very capable, intelligent, motivated young mum. It seems that having separated from John, she knew what she wanted to do. She just wanted to start again with her two girls, but without John. And the next stage in that process was working out what she would walk away with, what portion of the house and all the assets that they had jointly strived to achieve together she would be able to have to start again.
What's your instinct, Hedley? Is this case solvable?
Well, I think all these cases are potentially solvable. It would only take some fresh, new information that is really probative, that somebody has not disclosed, has for whatever reason decided to keep to themselves for many years. If somebody comes forward with that to the police directly, to me, then if it's corroborated and checked out, that can make a difference. It could show that somebody else, somebody other than John Winfield was responsible, for example. I mean, we don't know what happened on that Sunday night. John's story is she got into a car driven by a stranger and that's that. Who knows? Maybe somebody has some information about that. Maybe they have information about something else that John hasn't told us. But of course that can be solved. Bronwyn disappeared 9 years after Lynn disappeared. People believed that Lynn's case could never be solved, and it was.
There is an important difference in the stories of Lynn Sims and Bronwyn Winfield. John Winfield has never been charged, and there's no suggestion that he's anything like Chris Dawson. But the similarities between Lynn and Bronwyn are inescapable. Loving, protective mothers whose children were robbed of their right to a safe, secure maternal bond.
I think we need to be very careful to not conflate them or see them as being cut from the same cloth. John Winfield has always emphatically denied any involvement in foul play. He certainly has never been charged with anything. The coroner recommended to the then DPP Nicholas Cowdery that he should be charged and considered for prosecution over Bronwyn's suspected murder. But in the DPP's assessment back in 2003, there was insufficient evidence. Of course, there's no body, and some might argue that Bronwyn has been living a life somehow incognito, having never been seen. In my opinion, that is just completely implausible. Bronwyn's almost certainly dead. What we don't know is when she died and how she died, but the idea that a very committed mum of 31 years old could spend the next 31 years somehow eking out a life, remaining unnoticed, being able to support herself and never contact two little girls with whom she had a very beautiful and loving relationship is just ridiculous in my view.
Hedley Thomas is The Australian's National Chief Correspondent and the creator of our new investigative podcast series, Bronwyn. Subscribers to The Australian are the first to hear it. You can register to listen to the first 2 episodes now at bronwynpodcast.com. We've also got exclusive stories, maps, timelines, graphics and video. And for all Australia's best journalism 24/7, go to theaustralian.com.au. Thanks for joining us on The Front this week. Our team is Kristen Amiot, Leah Tamaglu, Josh Burton, Jasper Leake, Tiffany Dimmack, Matthew Condon and me, Claire Harvey.